Do not touch that line. Rachel Bennett's voice rang through the emergency room with such calm authority that every conversation seemed to disappear at once. The young man standing beside the hospital bed stopped in mid-motion, his fingers only inches from the intravenous tubing connected to an elderly patient's arm. For a brief second, even the relentless beeping of cardiac monitors felt quieter. Rain pounded against the glass entrance of Mercy Heights Hospital while ambulance sirens echoed through downtown Boston. It was just after 9:30 on a stormy Friday night, and the emergency department had reached capacity after a chain reaction crash on Interstate 90. Stretchers lined the hallways. Physicians hurried between trauma rooms. Nurses moved with practiced urgency, calling out medication doses, checking vital signs, and reassuring frightened families. Rachel barely noticed the chaos around her. Every ounce of her attention belonged to Walter Hayes, a 70-year-old retired mechanic whose blood pressure continued to fall despite aggressive treatment. His skin had grown pale, his breathing remained shallow, and the trauma surgeon had already requested the last available operating room. They simply needed a few more minutes to stabilize him before transport. The automatic doors suddenly opened again, letting in a rush of cold air and a group of men dressed in tailored black suits. They moved with quiet confidence, clearing a path for a young man whose expensive designer jacket looked untouched except for a narrow cut above his eyebrow. Dylan Romano barely glanced at the crowded waiting room before walking directly toward Rachel's treatment bay. Several employees exchanged uneasy looks. No one needed an introduction. Everyone knew exactly who he was. The only son of Anthony Romano. Rachel continued adjusting Walter's oxygen mask without looking up. "Miss," Dylan called impatiently. "You are coming with me." She finished securing the monitor leads before answering. "The triage nurse will take care of you." Dylan frowned as though he had misunderstood. "No. I said you are coming with me." Rachel finally met his eyes. "Your injury has already been evaluated. You are stable." His expression hardened. "Do you know who I am?" Rachel nodded once. "Yes." "Then you also know I do not wait." Walter groaned softly, his trembling hand searching across the blanket until Rachel gently placed her own hand over his. "Stay with me, Mr. Hayes," she whispered. "We are almost there." Dylan took another step into the treatment area, looking past Rachel toward the old man. "Move him somewhere else." Rachel remained exactly where she was. "He cannot be moved yet." Irritation replaced Dylan's confidence. "I need that operating room. He needs it to survive." The words hung in the air like a challenge no one expected her to make. Nurses stopped walking. A respiratory therapist froze beside the supply cart. Even the security officer near the entrance hesitated, uncertain whether to intervene. Dylan reached toward the intravenous line connected to Walter's arm, convinced no one would stop him. Rachel immediately stepped between them, gently moving his hand away before he could touch anything. "Do not touch that line," she repeated. Dylan stared at her in disbelief before slowly pulling out his phone. Without breaking eye contact, he pressed a familiar number and waited only a moment before speaking. "Dad," he said evenly. "A nurse just chose an old stranger over your son." Rachel Bennett lowered Dylan Romano's hand only after she was certain the intravenous line remained secure, then immediately turned back to Walter Hayes as another alarm sounded from the cardiac monitor. His blood pressure continued drifting downward, and the trauma team had only a narrow window to stabilize him before surgery. Around them, the emergency department remained strangely silent. Nurses who normally moved with effortless confidence now hesitated, aware that one impulsive decision could place every career in the room at risk. Dylan slipped his phone back into his pocket with complete certainty that his father would soon solve the problem. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. Instead, he looked around the treatment bay as though everything inside already belonged to him. "You have one chance to fix this," he said calmly. "Walk away from him and come with me. Rachel adjusted Walter's oxygen mask and checked his pulse once again before answering. The physician assigned to you will be here shortly. Dylan smiled without warmth. That was not a request. Walter opened his eyes for only a moment, confused by the unfamiliar voices surrounding him. Rachel leaned closer so he could hear only her voice. You are doing well, Mr. Hayes. Stay with me. We are almost ready. The older man managed the slightest nod before closing his eyes again. Dylan watched the exchange with growing frustration. Do you really think his life is more important than mine? Rachel met his gaze with quiet confidence. I think his condition is more urgent than yours. Several feet away, Megan Foster stood frozen with a bag of intravenous fluids in her hands, uncertain whether to enter the room or wait for instructions. Dr. Nathan Cole emerged from another trauma bay after finishing with a different patient and immediately sensed the tension filling the hallway. He quickly reviewed Walter's monitor and understood exactly why Rachel had refused to leave. How much longer until the operating room is ready? He asked. Approximately 4 minutes, Rachel answered. Nathan nodded. Then we stay focused. Before anyone could continue, hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor. Linda Crawford, the hospital's executive director, appeared with 2 administrative supervisors following closely behind. Her expression changed the instant she recognized Dylan Romano. Professional concern gave way to unmistakable anxiety. Mr. Romano, I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding, she said before turning toward Rachel. Nurse Bennett, step away from the patient immediately. Rachel remained exactly where she was. He is not stable enough for transfer. Linda's voice became firmer. Another nurse will take over. Rachel shook her head once. Interrupting treatment right now creates unnecessary risk. Linda folded her arms. That is not your decision anymore. Nathan stepped forward carefully. She is correct. We should complete stabilization before changing caregivers. Linda barely looked at him. Dr. Cole, this is an administrative matter. She turned back to Rachel. You are relieved of duty effective immediately. Megan stared in disbelief while several nurses quietly looked away, unable to watch. Rachel slowly removed her identification badge from around her neck but placed it gently on the nearby counter instead of handing it over. Then she picked up another syringe, confirmed the medication with Nathan, and calmly continued treating Walter. Linda's face tightened with disbelief. At that exact moment, one of the hospital information technology technicians hurried toward the nurse's station carrying a tablet. He whispered something into Linda's ear, and the color immediately drained from her face. Every security camera covering the emergency entrance had suddenly disappeared from the hospital's live monitoring system. The emergency department fell into an uneasy silence as the information technology technician whispered into Linda Crawford's ear. She took the tablet from his hands, stared at the screen for several long seconds, and then looked toward Dylan Romano with visible uncertainty. Every camera covering the emergency entrance had disappeared from the hospital's monitoring network at almost the exact moment the confrontation began. Rachel Bennett barely noticed the conversation. Walter Hayes remained her only priority. His breathing had become steadier after the latest medication, but the monitor still warned that precious minutes mattered. Dr. Nathan Cole reviewed the updated readings and quietly nodded. He is ready for transport, he said. Rachel carefully adjusted Walter's blanket before the surgical team wheeled him toward the operating room. As the doors closed behind the stretcher, she finally allowed herself one slow breath. Whatever happened next, Walter now had a real chance to survive. Dylan watched the operating room doors disappear from view with obvious frustration. This is not over, he said. Linda forced a reassuring smile toward him even though her own confidence had begun to fade. Mr. Romano, I promise this situation will be addressed immediately. Before anyone could answer, the automatic entrance doors opened once again. The sound of rain filled the lobby. for a brief moment before the doors quietly closed. A tall man wearing a dark overcoat stepped inside without haste. There were no loud introductions and no dramatic display of authority. One man carrying a leather portfolio followed several steps behind him. Yet the effect on the hospital staff was immediate. Receptionists stopped typing. Security officers instinctively straightened their posture. Even the conversations in nearby waiting areas gradually faded away. Anthony Romano entered the emergency department with the calm confidence of someone who never needed to announce his presence. His expression revealed neither anger nor concern. He simply observed. His eyes moved across the crowded department, taking in the exhausted nurses, the anxious families, the overturned supply cart near Walter's treatment area, and finally Dylan standing beside Linda. Dylan walked toward his father first. "She ignored me," he said. "She treated some old man like he mattered more than I did." Linda quickly added, "Mr. Romano, the nurse behaved in an unacceptable manner. We have already removed her from duty, and we are fully prepared to take additional disciplinary action." Anthony did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward Rachel, who had quietly begun documenting Walter's treatment in the electronic medical record. She neither approached him nor attempted to defend herself. She simply continued completing the chart with the same careful attention she gave every patient. Anthony finally spoke. "Nurse." Rachel looked up. "Yes, sir? Did you know who my son was?" "Yes." "And you still refuse to leave your patient?" Rachel answered without hesitation. "Mr. Hayes arrived with a life-threatening emergency. Your son's injury was stable. My responsibility was determined by medical need, not by family name." Anthony studied her for several quiet seconds before shifting his attention toward Linda. Was the older gentleman in immediate danger? Linda hesitated. "According to the physicians, yes." Anthony nodded once. "Then why was the nurse disciplined for following hospital protocol?" Linda opened her mouth but found no immediate answer. Before she could speak again, the man standing beside Anthony quietly stepped forward and opened the leather portfolio. "Sir," he said calmly, "there is something you should see." One of our security vehicles remained parked outside the emergency entrance. Its recording system captured everything from the moment Mr. Romano arrived. James Walker placed the leather portfolio on the nurse's station and carefully removed a tablet from inside. Without speaking, he tapped the screen twice before turning it toward Anthony Romano. The recording began with rain falling across the hospital entrance. Every movement appeared with remarkable clarity. Dylan stepped out of his vehicle, walked through the emergency doors, ignored the triage nurse, and headed directly toward Walter Hayes' treatment area. Rachel Bennett never left her patient's side. The recording captured every word spoken inside the emergency department. Dylan demanded immediate treatment. Rachel calmly explained that another patient faced a life-threatening emergency. It showed Walter struggling to breathe while the trauma team worked around him. Most importantly, it clearly showed Dylan reaching toward the intravenous tubing before Rachel gently moved his hand away and repeated the same words she had spoken only moments earlier. "Do not touch that line." Nobody in the emergency department spoke while the recording continued. Linda Crawford watched with growing uneasiness as the video documented every decision made after she arrived. It showed her apologizing to Dylan before she had even asked what happened. It showed her ordering Rachel away from Walter despite Dr. Nathan Cole warning that interrupting treatment created unnecessary risk. It showed Rachel removing her identification badge but continuing to care for Walter because the patient still depended on her. When the recording ended, the silence felt heavier than before. Anthony looked at Dylan first. "Did this recording change anything that happened tonight?" Dylan looked away. "She embarrassed me." Anthony remained calm. "That was not my question." Dylan offered no answer. Linda quickly stepped forward, trying to regain control. "Mr. Romano, everyone was under tremendous pressure. We can resolve this privately before unnecessary conclusions are drawn. Anthony slowly turned toward her. There is nothing private about how patients are treated inside a hospital. Before Linda could respond, the operating room doors opened at the end of the hallway. The surgical team carefully wheeled Walter into the recovery area. His procedure had gone well, but he remained tired and weak as Rachel quietly walked beside the bed, checking his oxygen and monitoring equipment. Walter slowly opened his eyes. His gaze wandered across the room until it stopped on Anthony. Confusion gave way to recognition. "Anthony," he whispered softly. Anthony stepped closer, surprised to hear his own name spoken with such familiarity. Walter smiled faintly despite his exhaustion. "You have more gray hair than the last time I saw you." Anthony searched the older man's face before something deep in his memory finally surfaced. "Mr. Hayes?" Walter gave a small nod. "You were 16 when you came into my repair shop looking for work. Everyone else saw trouble. I saw a kid who needed someone to believe in him." Rachel quietly stepped back, realizing she was witnessing something neither wealth nor influence could have predicted. Anthony looked at the worn silver wristwatch resting beside Walter's hospital bed, the same watch the older man had worn every afternoon while teaching him how to rebuild old engines decades earlier. The realization settled over him with unexpected weight. The patient his son had wanted pushed aside was the man who had given him his first honest opportunity when almost no one else would. Anthony remained silent for several long moments before turning toward James. "No one leaves this hospital tonight," he said quietly. "I want to know everything that happened here long before my son walked through those doors." Anthony Romano remained beside Walter Hayes's bed for another quiet moment before turning toward Rachel Bennett. The noise of the emergency department slowly returned around them, but everyone nearby continued watching, convinced the next few minutes would decide her future. Linda Crawford folded her hands with cautious confidence, believing the situation had finally shifted back under her control. Dylan Romano stood silently beside his father, expecting Rachel to pay for the humiliation he believed she had caused. Anthony spoke without raising his voice. "Nurse Bennett, would you walk with me for a moment?" Rachel glanced toward Dr. Nathan Cole, who gave a small reassuring nod before stepping beside Walter's bed. "I will stay with him," Nathan said quietly. Rachel followed Anthony and James Walker through a short hallway into a small consultation room normally used for private family meetings. The room was simple, with a round table, 4 chairs, and a window overlooking the rain-soaked parking lot. James quietly closed the door behind them before placing a thin folder on the table. Anthony remained standing while Rachel waited without speaking. After several seconds, Anthony gently pushed the folder toward her. "Inside is an employment proposal," he said evenly. "A position at one of my family's private medical foundations. Your salary would be more than double your current income. Full benefits. Educational funding. Complete job security." Rachel looked down at the folder but made no effort to open it. Anthony continued. "There is only one condition. Tonight remains private. No interviews. No complaints. No legal action." The room became completely silent. Rain tapped softly against the window while the heating system hummed overhead. Rachel slowly opened the folder. The offer was generous by any standard. The salary alone would erase years of student loans and financial uncertainty. She quietly closed it again and slid it back across the table. "Mr. Romano," she said gently, "if I accept this, I would spend the rest of my life wondering whether I protected a patient or sold the truth." Anthony watched her carefully. "You are refusing financial security." Rachel nodded. "I became a nurse because people deserve someone who will stand beside them when they cannot stand for themselves. If I trade that away, then I lose something far more valuable than money." James looked toward Anthony without saying a word. Anthony slowly picked up the folder and placed it back inside the portfolio. There was no disappointment in his expression. If anything, there was quiet respect. "Thank you," he said simply. Rachel looked slightly surprised. For what? For answering honestly. Together they returned to the emergency department where anxious employees immediately looked up from every corner of the room. Linda stepped forward with a relieved smile. "Mr. Romano, I trust we have reached an understanding." Anthony faced the assembled staff before speaking in the same calm voice that had silenced the department earlier. "Yes." Dylan's confidence returned. Rachel quietly prepared herself for whatever came next. Anthony continued. "Rachel Bennett will not continue working under the current administration of this hospital." Gasps spread through the room. Megan Foster lowered her eyes. Dr. Nathan Cole tightened his grip on Walter's chart. Linda allowed herself a small breath of relief. Dylan smiled for the first time since his father arrived. Then Anthony calmly finished the sentence. "Because before this day ends, I will request an independent emergency review of this hospital's leadership, policies, and patient care practices. Until that process is complete, no one will decide Nurse Bennett's future." The smiles disappeared almost as quickly as they had appeared, and the confidence that had protected Linda only moments earlier began to quietly unravel. The confidence that had surrounded Linda Crawford only moments earlier faded into visible uncertainty as quiet conversations spread through the emergency department. Doctors, nurses, and administrative employees exchanged uneasy glances, each wondering how far an independent review might reach. Rachel Bennett remained near Walter Hayes's room, helping Dr. Nathan Cole complete the final post-operative assessments as though nothing outside the patient's recovery mattered. Walter's blood pressure had finally stabilized, and the steady rhythm on the monitor brought a quiet sense of relief that no courtroom or investigation could ever equal. "He is going to be all right," Nathan said softly after reviewing the latest results. Rachel smiled with genuine gratitude. "That is all I wanted to hear tonight." Across the hallway, James Walker opened his laptop at an empty workstation normally used by charge nurses. Without attracting unnecessary attention, he connected to a secure network and began reviewing archived system records that had automatically synchronized with the hospital's backup servers earlier that evening. Unlike the disabled hallway cameras, those records could not simply disappear. After several minutes, James looked toward Anthony Romano. "Sir, I believe we have found something important." Anthony quietly walked over while Linda watched from across the room with growing concern. James displayed a timeline of electronic audit logs showing repeated modifications to patient priority records over the previous 18 months. Each change included a user account, a timestamp, and the original data preserved by the backup system. The emergency triage classifications were altered after the patients had already been evaluated, James explained calmly. The original entries remain intact in the archived logs. Dr. Nathan Cole stepped closer, studying the screen with disbelief. Several case numbers immediately looked familiar. "I questioned these changes," he said quietly. "I remember asking why certain patients suddenly moved ahead of more critical cases." James nodded. "Your original notes were preserved before later revisions were entered." Linda immediately shook her head. "Administrative adjustments happen in every hospital. Resources change. Staffing changes. Circumstances change." Anthony remained calm. Medical urgency should not change because someone has influence. James opened another file. Audio records captured through the hospital's internal quality assurance reporting system documented previous concerns raised by physicians and nurses. Several anonymous reports described pressure to prioritize influential donors, elected officials, and wealthy families during periods of high patient volume. Rachel listened silently, her expression growing more thoughtful than surprised. She had sensed those patterns before but had never possessed evidence strong enough to challenge them. Nathan lowered his eyes. "I should have spoken louder." Rachel gently shook her head. You kept treating patients the best way you could. Sometimes people need proof before they can be heard. Not far away, Dylan Romano stood alone near the waiting area windows. For the first time that night, he watched Walter resting peacefully instead of seeing only the inconvenience the older man had represented. He remembered Rachel's words about medical need, then looked back toward his own small bandage and quietly realized how different the two situations had truly been. Anthony noticed the change but said nothing. Instead, he turned toward Linda one final time. Tonight did not expose one mistake, he said evenly. It revealed a culture that forgot why this hospital exists. No one answered. The silence filling the emergency department no longer belonged to fear of power. It belonged to people who had finally seen the truth documented in black and white, and understood that by sunrise, Mercy Heights Hospital would begin facing questions it could no longer avoid. By early morning, Mercy Heights Hospital no longer felt like a place where people could quietly look away. News of the independent review had traveled through every department before sunrise, and members of the hospital board, legal advisors, and senior physicians gathered in the main conference hall overlooking the emergency department. Rachel Bennett had no desire to attend. She was helping another nurse prepare medications for the morning patients when Dr. Nathan Cole approached with a gentle smile. "Mr. Hayes is asking for you," he said. Rachel walked into Walter Hayes's room and found him sitting upright for the first time since surgery. His color had returned, and although he still looked tired, the fear that had filled his face the previous evening was gone. "Looks like you won," Walter said quietly. Rachel smiled and adjusted the blanket over his knees. "No. We simply gave your body enough time to do the rest." Before Walter could answer, James Walker appeared at the doorway. "Miss Bennett, the hospital board would appreciate your presence." Rachel hesitated only briefly before following him upstairs. The conference hall was filled with physicians, department supervisors, nurses, and board members. Linda Crawford stood at one end of the room beside legal counsel, while Anthony Romano remained near the center without speaking. A large display screen had been prepared for the emergency review. As Rachel quietly entered, several nurses gave her encouraging smiles. She realized that for the first time since the previous night, no one looked away from her. Anthony stepped forward only after everyone had taken their seats. "Hospitals exist because people trust strangers with the lives they value most," he said calmly. "When that trust is compromised, silence becomes part of the problem." James activated the presentation. The recovered vehicle recording appeared first, followed by the preserved electronic audit logs and quality assurance reports. Timestamps, original triage classifications, and subsequent administrative changes appeared side by side. No dramatic accusations were necessary. The records explained everything more clearly than anger ever could. Board members quietly reviewed page after page while several physicians recognized cases they had questioned months earlier. One director finally looked toward Linda. "Were these revisions authorized?" Linda lowered her eyes before answering softly. "Some were administrative decisions intended to protect hospital relationships." "At the expense of patient priority?" another board member asked. She could not answer. Anthony then turned toward Dylan, who had remained silent throughout the entire meeting. "There is something you need to say." Dylan slowly stood. His voice lacked the confidence everyone had seen the night before. He looked directly at Rachel first. "I thought my name should matter more than someone else's emergency. I was wrong." He then faced Walter. "I am sorry for making a difficult night even harder." Walter offered only a gentle nod. "Learn from it. That is enough for me." The chairman of the hospital board quietly stood and addressed the room. Effective immediately, Linda Crawford was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the independent investigation, and an interim leadership team would oversee hospital operations. Additional external auditors would review emergency department policies and patient care procedures. Rachel listened without celebration. When the chairman asked whether she wished to make a statement, she answered simply, "I only hope the next nurse who protects the sickest patient never has to wonder whether doing the right thing will cost a career." The room remained silent for several moments because everyone understood that those words described not only one night, but the future every hospital should strive to protect. The conference hall slowly emptied as board members separated into smaller meetings to begin the formal review process, but Rachel Bennett returned directly to the emergency department without waiting for congratulations. New patients had arrived overnight, monitors continued sounding their steady rhythm, and frightened families still needed calm voices more than dramatic headlines. Megan Foster smiled as Rachel tied her identification badge back onto her uniform. "Most people would take the rest of the day off after everything that happened," she said. Rachel gently picked up a patient chart. Illness does not wait for celebrations. Word of the leadership changes spread quickly throughout Mercy Heights Hospital. Employees who had spent years quietly questioning difficult decisions now spoke openly with one another, and for the first time in a long while, the conversations carried hope instead of frustration. Dr. Nathan Cole approached Rachel during a brief break between patients. "The interim board wants to meet with you this afternoon," he said. "They have already voted to restore your position, remove every disciplinary record from your file, and offer you a promotion into nursing administration." Rachel thanked him politely but did not answer immediately. Several hours later she entered a small conference room where members of the interim leadership team waited beside Anthony Romano and James Walker. A folder rested on the table containing the official offer. The chairman smiled warmly. "Miss Bennett, this hospital would like you to become Director of Emergency Nursing Operations. Your leadership has already inspired confidence throughout the organization." Rachel quietly read every page before closing the folder. "I am honored," she said softly, "but I cannot accept this if it is simply meant to repair the hospital's public image." The room became silent. The chairman leaned forward. "What would you need in order to accept?" Rachel answered without hesitation. 3 commitments. First, emergency triage decisions must remain completely independent from financial influence or personal connections. Second, every employee who reports unsafe practices must be protected from retaliation. Third, patients without insurance deserve access to emergency support without feeling invisible. Anthony listened carefully before speaking. The Romano Foundation can provide long-term funding for the third commitment. Rachel turned toward him. "Only if one condition is accepted." Anthony smiled slightly, already expecting another difficult answer. "What condition?" "Your family name cannot appear on the program." "Neither can mine." Patients should never wonder whether compassion belongs to one person. It should belong to the hospital itself. James looked toward Anthony, waiting for his response. Anthony nodded without hesitation. "Agreed." Rachel relaxed for the first time since the previous evening. She extended her hand across the table, and Anthony accepted the handshake with quiet respect. There were no cameras, no reporters, and no applause waiting outside the room. Only a shared understanding that meaningful change rarely began with grand speeches. As the meeting ended, Anthony walked beside Rachel through the hospital courtyard where the morning rain had finally given way to clear autumn sunlight. Ambulances continued arriving, nurses hurried through the entrance, and another ordinary day had already begun. Anthony looked toward the busy emergency department before quietly asking, "Were you ever afraid of losing everything?" Rachel watched 2 young nurses rushing toward a patient being wheeled inside. "I was afraid someone would lose everything because everyone else was looking at the wrong person," she answered. Anthony lowered his eyes for a brief moment, understanding that the strongest lesson he had learned during the longest night of his life had come from someone who never sought power at all. 3 months later, Mercy Heights Hospital no longer resembled the place Rachel Bennett had walked into on that stormy Friday night. The emergency department remained just as busy, ambulances still arrived around the clock, and exhausted nurses still worked long hours, but one quiet difference could now be felt the moment patients entered the building. Every person was evaluated according to medical urgency alone. Wealth, influence, and family names no longer determined who was seen first. Independent oversight teams reviewed emergency triage decisions, anonymous reporting channels protected employees who raised concerns, and the new Patient Assistance Fund quietly covered treatment costs for families who otherwise would have faced impossible financial choices. Rachel never asked anyone to thank her. Every morning she tied her identification badge around her neck, greeted her coworkers with the same gentle smile, and returned to caring for patients exactly as she always had. To her, the greatest reward was not recognition. It was watching young nurses make difficult decisions without wondering whether honesty would cost them their careers. Walter Hayes returned for his final follow-up appointment carrying only a small cane instead of the hospital wheelchair that had supported him after surgery. As he slowly walked through the emergency department, nurses and physicians greeted him by name. Rachel met him near the entrance and smiled warmly. "You look stronger every time I see you." Walter laughed softly. "I had an excellent reason to keep getting better." Before leaving, he paused beside a simple bronze plaque mounted near the emergency waiting area. It did not honor a wealthy donor or a powerful family. Instead, it carried only a few quiet words. "Every patient comes first." Walter rested his hand against the plaque for a brief moment before continuing toward the exit with peaceful confidence. Outside, Dylan Romano unloaded boxes of medical supplies from a volunteer delivery truck assigned to the rehabilitation center where he now completed community service each week. The confidence that once came from privilege had gradually been replaced by humility earned through ordinary work. He greeted hospital employees respectfully, accepted instructions without complaint, and often spent extra time helping elderly patients carry personal belongings to their cars. Rachel noticed the change but never mentioned it. She believed actions always spoke more honestly than apologies. Late that afternoon, Rachel finished her shift and stepped into the cool autumn air. Anthony Romano stood near a quiet corner of the hospital courtyard holding 2 paper cups of coffee. There were no security vehicles waiting nearby and no crowds surrounding him, only James Walker standing several yards away with the respectful distance he always maintained. Anthony handed 1 cup to Rachel. "I remembered you prefer coffee after your shift instead of before it," he said with a faint smile. Rachel accepted it gratefully. "You remembered correctly." They stood together for several quiet minutes, watching another ambulance pull toward the emergency entrance where nurses hurried outside to receive the next patient. Anthony finally spoke. "For most of my life I believed power meant making sure people listened to me." Rachel watched the emergency team disappear through the automatic doors. "Real power is making sure the right people are heard." Anthony slowly nodded. "Walter taught me that years ago. You reminded me before I forgot it forever." Rachel glanced at the time and smiled. "I should head home. Another shift starts tomorrow." Anthony looked at her with genuine respect. "Then I will not keep you from the people who will need you." Rachel walked toward the employee parking lot without looking back immediately. Just before reaching her car, she turned and raised her coffee cup with a grateful smile. Anthony returned the gesture. James quietly stepped beside him after she disappeared from view. "Do you think she understands what she changed?" Anthony looked toward the bright lights of Mercy Heights Hospital where doctors, nurses, and patients continued moving through another ordinary evening. "She never tried to change the hospital," he answered softly. "She simply refused to abandon one life. Everything else changed because of that."